It was a quiet summer night in Briar Ridge, Alabama, the kind of night when the cicadas hummed their endless song and the stars burned bright in the cloudless sky. But for Officer Clark, that night would mark the beginning of a mystery that would consume him and his loyal K-9, Koda, for years to come. As the clock struck 8 p.m., the library door creaked open, and Marie Hayes, the town's beloved librarian, stepped out into the warm Alabama evening. She was 42, petite, with brown hair neatly pinned back and a gentle smile. For years, she had been a fixture in Briar Ridge, reliable, kind, and above all, predictable. Every evening, she locked the library door and drove home, a routine as regular as the setting sun. But tonight, as Marie's car merged onto Highway 431, something felt off. That was the last time anyone saw her. The evening had started like any other, Marie tidying up the library, ensuring the last of the books were returned to their shelves, her white ceramic mug filled with hot tea resting on her desk. She bid her colleagues goodbye with a soft smile and left, her brown leather purse swinging at her side, the door shutting behind her with a soft click. The townsfolk, who had lived in this sleepy community for decades, went about their evening, oblivious to the void soon to echo through their town. It was a neighbor, just a few minutes later, who noticed the faint glow of Marie's car as it drove past, heading south, its taillights disappearing into the dark. That was the last trace of her. By morning, the town was buzzing with the news. Briar Ridge was no stranger to minor mysteries, lost pets, misplaced bicycles, the occasional runaway teenager, but no one had ever vanished without a trace. Marie was different. She was a part of the town's heart. Her absence was like an empty space in the air, a disturbance too subtle to notice at first but impossible to ignore once felt. Marie's family was the first to realize something was wrong. Her brother, Aaron, showed up at her house before noon, knocking repeatedly on the door, calling her name. The house was eerily still. Her bed was untouched, the kitchen spotless, no sign of life anywhere. The windows, as usual, were closed, the curtains drawn. The phone, as expected, went unanswered. Aaron's gut twisted. Something wasn't right. By the time the police were called, the day had already slipped into a haze of confusion and dread. Officer Clark, who'd known Marie for years, was the one to take the call. He had seen her countless times at the library, helping the elderly with their books, offering a warm smile, and always keeping track of the town's latest gossip. Nothing about Marie had ever screamed danger or distress. He walked through the front door of her small house on the outskirts of Briar Ridge, scanning the rooms. It felt like walking through a time capsule, frozen in place. No one would have guessed that by the end of the night, Marie Hayes would have been just another missing person, her name added to a list of tragic and unsolved disappearances in the county. They searched the house, retraced her steps, and after several hours, found her silver sedan parked off the highway, just a few miles from her home. The car was unlocked, her purse sitting neatly on the passenger seat, but the driver's seat was empty. Nothing had been disturbed. The keys were still in the ignition. The scene was too clean. It was as though Marie had just gotten out and walked away, yet no one had seen her leave. Clark stood by the car, his K-9 partner, Koda, sitting beside him, ears alert. The dog was calm, but Clark knew that something wasn't right. He reached down and scratched Koda's head, his own mind racing. Where had she gone? Who could have taken her? The search began immediately. Clark and his fellow officers canvassed the area, retracing Marie's route. Koda was brought in to search the nearby woods and fields. He sniffed the air, leading them in tight circles, but after just a few hundred yards, the trail disappeared. It was as if Marie had vanished into thin air. And that was the problem. There was nothing. No evidence. No sign of a struggle. Just an empty car and the faintest traces of her scent that led nowhere. In the following days, the people of Briar Ridge rallied around the search efforts, but as the days wore on, the hope began to drain from the air. It wasn't long before the familiar hum of daily life returned, the small coffee shop reopened, the churches saw their usual attendance, and the familiar faces of the residents filled the town streets. But there was an underlying tension now. Everyone knew that if someone like Marie, kind and gentle, could disappear without a trace, anyone could. But despite the town's best efforts, the case went cold. Months passed. No new leads. No new witnesses. The only remaining trace of Marie was the memory of her smile, the empty seat at the library desk, and the faded flyers tacked to telephone poles that slowly began to curl at the edges, lost to the unforgiving Alabama heat. The case file sat in the back of the police department, buried under the weight of time, with only the faint hope that someone, someday, might find a clue. Officer Clark, however, couldn't let go. He revisited the scene day after day, hoping for a break, but the case felt like a door sealed shut, the answers too far out of reach. It wasn't until a year later, when he and Koda returned to the spot where Marie's car was found, that something changed. Koda's nose twitched. His ears perked up. And for the first time in months, Clark felt the adrenaline rush of hope. Something had shifted in the air. Something was about to break. But they had no idea what they were about to uncover. The days after Marie Hayes' disappearance blurred into an endless cycle of hope and despair. Briar Ridge, once a town defined by its quiet charm and slow pace, was now consumed by the unanswered question, where is Marie? It was as though the very fabric of the town had been torn, and no one knew how to stitch it back together. Officer Clark had been a part of this town for as long as he could remember. Born and raised in Briar Ridge, he knew the roads, the houses, the people. There wasn't much that slipped by him, and yet, Marie's disappearance left him shaken. There was no logical explanation, no clues, and the town's usual sense of security had evaporated, leaving behind a heavy, unsettling silence. As the sun began to dip behind the trees on that first evening of the search, Clark stood in front of Marie's house, looking at the familiar porch that had been the site of countless quiet evenings. There was no sign of struggle, no open windows or broken locks, but there was an unmistakable feeling in the air. Marie had lived here alone, and now, she was gone. The first few hours after the discovery of her car had been filled with a sense of urgency. Police cars lined the highway, and volunteers from the town had come out in droves to help search the surrounding area. The tall grasses, the overgrown fields, the thick woods, they all seemed like they could be hiding something. But after a few short hours, the energy that had once been so optimistic began to fade. The search dogs that had been brought in picked up Marie's scent, but after just a few hundred yards, they stopped. The trail vanished as if someone had carefully erased it. Clark ran his hand through his hair, staring out at the woods. His K9 partner, Koda, sat calmly at his side, his dark eyes trained on Clark, waiting for the next order. Clark looked down at his dog, knowing that Koda's abilities were as sharp as ever, but still, there was no breakthrough. "Come on, Koda. Let's give it another go," Clark muttered, the words feeling empty in the silence that surrounded them. They ventured deeper into the woods, the air thick with the scent of earth and damp leaves. Koda's nose twitched as he sniffed the ground, the cool evening breeze stirring the foliage. For hours, they combed the area with the same result, nothing. As nightfall approached, the flashlight beams of the other searchers began to flicker and fade. The town's hopes were fading with them. Despite the grim atmosphere, the search didn't stop. Clark and Koda returned to the scene the next morning. The police department had mobilized, calling in search teams from surrounding areas. The day was spent combing through fields, ditches, and the edges of the woods where Marie's car had been found. Volunteers scoured the area, and despite the ever-growing sense of dread, no one stopped. They couldn't. As the hours dragged on, the sun climbed higher, but the air felt heavier. The police and volunteers worked in silence, their movements almost mechanical now, their voices low. Koda moved from one spot to the next, sniffing at the ground, his steps confident, but Clark could see the frustration mounting in his dog's eyes. The first clue came by accident. As a group of volunteers stumbled through the underbrush, one of them kicked something hidden in the dirt. A glint of metal caught the sunlight. The volunteer bent down and pulled it out. It was a small, silver bracelet, tattered and weathered, but clearly identifiable. "Is this hers?" one of the volunteers asked, holding the bracelet up for the others to see. Clark's heart skipped a beat. The bracelet was familiar, he'd seen it on Marie's wrist more than once. He rushed over to the volunteer, confirming it with a quick glance. "This is hers," Clark said, his voice low. "We're getting closer." But the discovery didn't bring relief. If anything, it deepened the mystery. How had Marie's bracelet ended up here, in the woods? How had it been hidden beneath the dirt, and what did it mean? Clark's mind raced. He knelt down beside Koda, gently tugging on the leash. "Let's go, boy," he said, the determination in his voice clear. He couldn't stop. Not yet. Not with this small piece of evidence in his hand. If the town was ever going to heal, they needed answers. They moved deeper into the woods, following the same path Koda had walked the night before. Clark's senses were on high alert, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. It wasn't just about finding Marie anymore. It was about solving the mystery of how something so simple as a librarian's disappearance had shaken the entire town to its core. As they walked, the sun dipped lower in the sky. The shadows grew longer, and the air thickened with humidity. But Koda's nose was still sharp. Clark watched as his K9 partner paused, sniffing the ground in front of him, his tail flicking once, twice. The dog's eyes locked with Clark's. "Do you smell something, Koda?" Clark asked, his voice low. Koda barked softly, his tail wagging. Clark knelt beside him, trying to see what had caught Koda's attention. And then, he saw it. A small, rusted piece of metal was half buried in the dirt. It wasn't much, but it was something. Clark knelt down to investigate, brushing away the dirt carefully. It was a keychain, tarnished and old, but with a logo on it that looked familiar. He squinted. It was from the local library. Clark's heart began to race. Marie had worked at that library for years, and yet, here was a piece of her life, hidden away in the woods. His mind began to form a theory, but it didn't make sense. Why would Marie's personal items be scattered in such a remote area? And who would have taken them there? Just then, Koda let out a low growl, his eyes scanning the woods as if he had caught the faintest trace of something on the wind. Clark stood up slowly, his hand resting on Koda's back, feeling the tension in the dog's muscles. The search had already taken too long, but now it felt different. They were on the right track. There had to be more. They had to keep going. But the truth was out there, hidden in the woods of Briar Ridge, and Marie's disappearance was only the beginning. Clark felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The answers were close, but the mystery of Marie's vanishing was only starting to unfold. And he, along with Koda, was going to find them, no matter what it took. The summer of 2006 marked 1 year since Marie Hayes had disappeared without a trace from Briar Ridge, Alabama. The town, once a close-knit community of familiar faces and slow-moving days, had begun to change. There was an undercurrent of unease now, a whisper behind closed doors that carried the weight of the unsolved mystery. People locked their doors a little tighter, glanced over their shoulders a little more often, and found themselves pausing at strange sounds in the night. The question hung heavy over the town: where was Marie? For Officer Clark, the case was a gnawing presence in the back of his mind, one that wouldn't let go. He'd put in countless hours retracing Marie's route, interviewing neighbors, friends, and family, but each attempt to get closer to the truth only seemed to take him farther away. Koda, his German Shepherd K9, had done his best, sniffing out scents that led nowhere, but after months of fruitless searching, Clark found himself standing at a crossroads. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was just out of reach. It was during one of his routine patrols through the outskirts of town that Clark caught a break. He was passing by the old farmhouse where Rick Dawson, a mechanic in his mid-30s, lived with his wife and kids. Dawson had been a neighbor to Marie, though they'd had a few tense run-ins over the years, mostly over a fence dispute. Nothing serious, just typical small-town disagreements. But for some reason, something about Rick had always stuck in Clark's mind. It was hard to ignore the fact that Dawson's temper was as quick as his hands when he was angry, and there was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't as friendly as he appeared. Clark had heard the rumors about Rick. Neighbors spoke of his explosive nature, especially after a few drinks. He'd had run-ins with the law over the years, a couple of DUI arrests and a bar fight that had sent someone to the hospital. But in a town like Briar Ridge, those were considered small-town problems, the kind of things people brushed off with a knowing shake of the head. Still, Clark couldn't let go of the uneasy feeling that Rick had more to do with Marie's disappearance than he was letting on. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Clark decided to pay Rick a visit. The sound of tires swishing through puddles on the narrow dirt road seemed to echo in the quiet as he pulled up to the Dawson house. The two-story, worn-down farmhouse had seen better days, but it stood solid against the storm, like so many of the houses in this part of Briar Ridge. Rick's truck was parked in the driveway, the engine warm from a recent trip. Clark stepped out of his patrol car, the rain drizzling down, and walked toward the porch. He could see Rick through the window, sitting in a faded armchair, his back to the door. There was something off about the scene. It wasn't just the rain or the late hour, it was the way Rick sat there, alone, in the dim light, like he had been waiting for something, or someone. With a sigh, Clark knocked on the door. There was a long pause before Rick stood up and slowly opened it, his face masked with feigned surprise. "Clark," he said, his voice thick with the remnants of a night's sleep. "What brings you out here in this weather?" "Need to ask you a few questions," Clark replied, keeping his voice steady. "It's about Marie Hayes. You got a minute?" Rick's demeanor shifted. It was subtle, but Clark noticed the slight twitch of his jaw, the way his eyes darted to the side before meeting Clark's gaze again. "Marie? I don't know anything about her, Clark. You know that. Been over this." Clark wasn't convinced. He stepped inside the doorway, his eyes scanning the room. It was modest, well-kept, and smelled faintly of something burning in the kitchen. The worn-out furniture and cluttered countertop spoke to the life of a man who kept to himself but was far from poor. "You ever seen her car around here?" Clark asked, glancing around. Rick's eyes narrowed slightly. "Her car? No, I don't think so. Why would I?" Clark wasn't sure why, but Rick's answer didn't sit right with him. His gut told him there was more to Rick than he was letting on, and the fact that he couldn't even offer a decent explanation for his interactions with Marie made Clark's suspicions grow. "Where were you the night she disappeared?" Clark pressed, his tone sharp but measured. "You know, August 12th. The night she left the library." Rick shifted uncomfortably, his eyes glancing toward the kitchen. "I was working late at the shop. You can ask anyone. The guys will vouch for me." "I already talked to your co-workers," Clark said, his voice cool. "They said you were at work, but some of them said you had a break around midnight. You sure you didn't leave?" Rick stiffened, his posture becoming rigid. "What's this about, Clark?" "I told you. I was working. I didn't leave the shop." Clark wasn't sure if Rick was lying or if he was simply too good at hiding the truth. The man's alibi checked out, at least on the surface, but Clark couldn't ignore the knot in his stomach. There was something Clark couldn't put his finger on. Before Clark could press further, Koda shifted behind him, moving into the room. The dog's nose twitched, scanning the air. Then, without warning, Koda bolted toward the back door, his tail stiff with focus. Clark's heart skipped a beat. "Hold up," Clark said, motioning for Rick to stay put. "What's going on?" Rick, for the first time since Clark arrived, looked genuinely unsettled. "I don't know. That dog's been acting strange lately." Clark followed Koda, who was now sniffing a pile of old tools near the back door. Koda stopped abruptly, his nose hovering over a rusted wrench. He pawed at the ground, growling softly. "Yeah, he's been acting up. I've noticed," Rick said, his voice low, almost defensive. But Clark wasn't listening anymore. He crouched down and glanced at the wrench Koda had sniffed out. The metal gleamed faintly in the low light, but it wasn't just the wrench that caught his eye. Beneath it, buried under a pile of old tarps, was a scrap of fabric, dark and frayed. Clark's pulse quickened. "I think we need to take a look at that," Clark said, his voice steady. Rick tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the doorframe as Clark knelt to pull the fabric free. It was a torn piece of dark denim, stained at the edges, and it smelled faintly of something metallic. "Where'd this come from?" Clark asked, rising to his feet. Rick didn't answer. His lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze darting from Clark to the door. "I'm not sure," Rick mumbled, his voice barely audible. Clark's instincts screamed at him. There was more here than just an old dispute between neighbors. There was something much darker hiding behind Rick's quiet demeanor. "Let's go," Clark said, his voice unwavering. He didn't wait for Rick to respond, but instead, he led Koda out of the house, the fabric still clutched tightly in his hand. Koda, as always, stayed close, his eyes locked onto Clark's as if he understood what had just happened. The game had changed. The investigation had just taken an unexpected turn. And Clark was more determined than ever to see it through. As they walked back to the patrol car, Clark couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer. The answers were still out there, hiding in plain sight, and with Koda by his side, he wasn't about to give up until they were found. The summer heat in Briar Ridge had begun to fade, but the town still simmered with tension. For a year, the case of Marie Hayes' disappearance had hung over them like a thick fog, unsettling everyone who had once known her. Officer Clark had kept working tirelessly, revisiting every corner of the investigation, every clue, every lead, but it all seemed to circle back to the same dead end. No one had seen Marie leave her car. No one had heard a thing. The community had rallied around her family, but the answers remained elusive, drifting further into the shadows with each passing day. Clark's days had become a blur of interviews, phone calls, and painstaking re-examinations of the case file. But on the anniversary of Marie's disappearance, something in the air changed. It was as if the town, after a year of restless waiting, was holding its breath for one final exhale. And that exhale came in the form of a new lead, one that Clark wasn't sure he believed at first. It started with a tip. A man named Jack Miller, a local truck driver who had been on Highway 431 the night Marie disappeared, had come forward. Jack had never been interviewed during the initial investigation. He had been passing through Briar Ridge late that evening, just as the sky darkened and the humid air thickened. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it, but now, as the anniversary of Marie's disappearance loomed, something about the events that night had been bothering him. He had been driving west, past the place where Marie's car had been found abandoned, when he saw it, the faintest flicker of headlights veering off the main road. Jack hadn't thought it was unusual at first, after all, the road was rarely busy at that hour. But the more he thought about it, the more he felt an eerie sense of unease. Something had felt wrong about the car, how it sped onto an unmarked dirt road, disappearing from view before he could get a closer look. Jack had kept his mouth shut for months, thinking it was just another passing moment, but the memory gnawed at him. He finally decided to call the Briar Ridge Police Department and share what he had seen. It was a small break in the case, but it was a break. Clark listened closely as Jack described the moment in detail, from the exact time to the direction of the headlights. Everything matched perfectly with the timeline of Marie's disappearance. Clark knew he had to check this out, and so, with Koda by his side, he returned to the spot where Jack had seen the car veer off. The area was familiar, yet Clark felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as they ventured deeper into the overgrown path where the truck driver had last seen the car. Koda sniffed the air, his nose twitching, as they scoured the forest's edge. Clark felt a sudden weight in his chest. There was something about this place, something haunting about the silence that seemed to envelope them. They walked for what felt like hours, with Koda leading the way through the dense trees and thick underbrush, but it wasn't until the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, that Koda stopped suddenly and raised his head. He let out a low growl, his eyes focused on something just ahead. Clark's heart raced, and his steps quickened as he followed Koda through the dense woods. And then, there it was. A silver bracelet. Marie's silver bracelet. Clark's breath caught in his throat. He kneeled beside Koda, his fingers brushing against the weathered piece of metal that had once adorned Marie's wrist. It was an unmistakable match. He knew this was her, this was the one thing that had been missing all along, and now, after a year of endless searching, they had finally found something concrete. The bracelet glinted in the fading light, a tragic reminder that Marie had been here. But where was her body? Clark's mind raced, and he felt a surge of adrenaline rush through his veins. He scanned the area, looking for any other signs, any other clues. Koda continued to sniff around the ground, his ears pinned back, sensing the heavy tension in the air. For a moment, everything seemed to stop, the wind, the rustling leaves, even the rhythmic beat of Clark's heart. Then, just as Clark was about to call for backup, something caught his eye in the distance. A glint of something shiny, half buried under the soil. He moved toward it quickly, brushing away dirt and leaves, revealing a small object buried beneath the ground. It was Marie's phone. The same phone that had been missing for over a year. Clark's hands trembled as he picked up the phone, but the familiar weight of the device felt strange in his palm. The screen was cracked, but the familiar purple case was still attached. It seemed to call out to him, as if telling him that they were closer than ever before to discovering what had truly happened to Marie. The realization hit him hard, Marie hadn't just disappeared. Someone had taken her, and the answers had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Clark turned to Koda, whose alert eyes seemed to say, "We're not done yet." It wasn't just about finding Marie's body now. It was about finding out who did this, why, and how they had covered their tracks for so long. This was more than just a missing person case, it was a puzzle, one piece at a time, slowly starting to come together. Clark picked up his radio, calling in the discovery. "I've found something. I need backup. And we're not done here." His voice was steady, but the weight of everything that had transpired was beginning to settle in. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope. The investigation had just taken a new turn, and Clark, with Koda by his side, wasn't about to let it slip away again. The thick Alabama summer heat lingered long after the sun dipped below the horizon, a humid cloak settling over Briar Ridge. Officer Clark wiped the sweat from his brow, feeling the exhaustion of another long day. The case that had haunted him for the past year seemed to drag on without end, a gnawing frustration festering inside him. He had promised Marie Hayes' family that he wouldn't give up, that he would find her or at least find out what had happened. But the truth felt more elusive than ever. Koda, his German Shepherd partner, sat beside him, looking just as tired, though his sharp eyes never wavered. The dog had become Clark's most trusted ally in the search for Marie, his ability to track scents, find clues, and provide a sense of direction when all hope seemed lost, an invaluable tool. Yet, even Koda's skills had their limits. They had scoured miles of forest and terrain near the abandoned car, but it was as if Marie had evaporated into thin air. Clark leaned against his patrol car, his eyes scanning the thick woods ahead, thinking about the past few months of dead ends. The last substantial lead they had was the discovery of the silver bracelet, buried deep in the woods near the Tallapoosa River, over 15 miles from where Marie's car had been abandoned. The discovery of the bracelet was significant. It was a personal item, something that confirmed that Marie had indeed been in that area, but it raised more questions than it answered. Why had her body been so far away from the car? Who could have taken her there, and why? Clark had tried to put the pieces together, but the case kept slipping away from him, like water through his fingers. He felt the frustration creeping in, the sensation of being so close yet so far from the truth. Then, as he stared into the darkness of the woods, a low growl from Koda broke his concentration. The dog's ears perked up, and his body stiffened. Clark straightened, his senses alert. It was that feeling again, the one he had felt back in the early days of the investigation, the one that made him trust Koda's instincts. "Let's go, boy," Clark muttered, reaching for the flashlight. Koda began to move, his tail low, nose twitching in the air. The two of them moved forward through the dense undergrowth, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness ahead of them. Clark's heart rate picked up. Was this it? Had they finally found something? They pushed forward, Koda leading the way. The beam of light flickered over the ground, over roots, rocks, and overgrown brush. Then, the light caught something, a small glint in the dirt. Clark knelt down, brushing aside leaves and debris, his fingers trembling slightly. It was a fragment of fabric, torn and stained, with faint threads of what looked like blood. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just any piece of cloth. It was something Marie could have worn. Koda's nose was already down, sniffing around the area with renewed energy. Clark's mind raced, piecing together what they had discovered. He carefully collected the fragment and sealed it in an evidence bag, then continued to follow Koda, who was now pulling him forward. The trail led them deeper into the woods, closer to the river. It was getting late, but Clark couldn't stop now. His mind was laser-focused, each step bringing him closer to a piece of the puzzle he had been chasing for so long. As they approached the riverbank, Koda began to whimper softly, a low sound that signaled both curiosity and caution. Clark knelt beside the dog, scanning the area in front of him. The dense trees parted slightly, revealing a small clearing near the water. There, lying in the thick brush, was a body. Clark's breath caught in his throat as he carefully approached, his flashlight trained on the form. It was human, female. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Was this Marie? The body was lying face down, and as Clark carefully turned it over, he felt his heart sink. It wasn't Marie. But it was close. The body belonged to another woman, someone who had been left there in a similar manner. Her clothes were torn, and there were signs of a struggle. The forensic team would need to confirm the identity, but one thing was clear, the mystery was far from over. This discovery opened a new chapter in the investigation, one that deepened the intrigue of what had happened to Marie Hayes. Could this be another victim? Or was this a clue, a piece of the puzzle that could finally tie everything together? Clark stood up, his mind spinning. He quickly radioed for backup, the urgency of the situation hitting him hard. He had to know who this woman was, and he needed to understand how her case connected to Marie's. The next few days were a blur of activity. Forensic teams arrived, combing through the area, collecting evidence. The body was removed for identification, and the team searched the riverbank for any additional clues. Meanwhile, Clark and Koda returned to the site where the body had been found, scouring the area for any overlooked evidence. Then, the breakthrough came. The DNA found on the body matched someone from the local community. It was a man named Marcus Harris, a local mechanic with a criminal history of violent behavior. His name had come up in the early stages of the investigation but was dismissed due to his lack of direct ties to Marie. Now, things were different. Clark sat in the quiet of his office, the weight of the new information pressing on him. This man, Marcus Harris, was the key. And as the pieces started to fall into place, Clark realized that the investigation was about to take a dangerous turn. Harris had been seen near Marie's library on the day she disappeared, and now it seemed that he had been involved in the disappearance of this second woman. Clark's instincts told him this wasn't just coincidence. The connection between Marie and Harris was too strong to ignore. He felt the urgency building again, the way it had when Koda had first led him into the woods. They were getting close, too close to let up now. But as Clark and Koda prepared to confront Marcus Harris, he knew that there were still many unanswered questions. The truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And if Harris was behind both disappearances, there was no telling what danger he would bring when cornered. The investigation had shifted into high gear, and Clark felt the weight of every decision pressing down on him. He had come so far. But there was still one last step, one final clue to uncover. And he couldn't stop until he had the truth. The next few days would determine everything. It was the kind of crisp morning that made you believe everything could be set right. The trees around Briar Ridge swayed gently in the breeze, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. But for Officer Clark, the calmness of the town was deceptive. He and his K-9 partner, Koda, had been through too much together. And today, he was hoping, no, praying, that the twisted road that had haunted them for over a year would finally lead somewhere. The case had been reopened after a new lead surfaced, a strange, unexpected breakthrough that Clark had no choice but to pursue. It had started with a simple discovery. A small piece of fabric found during a search, just a few miles from where Marie Hayes' car had been abandoned. But this wasn't just any fabric. It was a rare, industrial-type material, something that didn't belong to Marie. Clark had taken it to forensics, and within days, a match had been made. The DNA found on the fabric belonged to none other than Rick Dawson. Rick Dawson, the name that had been haunting Briar Ridge for over a year. The man who had a history of aggression and who had always seemed just a little too friendly with Marie. The man who had an alibi, a solid one, that had cleared him in the past. But now, with the new evidence and a growing sense of dread gnawing at Clark's gut, things had changed. Rick Dawson was no longer a name lost in the pages of an old case file. He was the prime suspect, and with Koda's tracking skills and the ever-growing pile of evidence, Clark felt the weight of the case pressing down on him. It had started slowly. At first, Clark had spent hours going over old records, sifting through witness statements, even retracing Marie's last known steps. He had pulled out everything from the first days of the investigation, the maps, the photos, the notes that had once seemed insignificant. And with each new piece of evidence, a clearer picture began to form. That afternoon, Clark stood in front of Rick Dawson's house, Koda by his side, the dog's eyes scanning the street as if the answer was somewhere out there, hidden in plain sight. Clark had been here before, many times. But now, things were different. He could feel it. He could sense the shift in the air. It wasn't just about Marie anymore. This was bigger. This was about justice. Clark's hand tightened around the radio in his belt, signaling the team to begin their surveillance. For the past few weeks, they had been following Dawson, gathering evidence. They had seen him at church, at the local grocery store, and even at the mechanic shop where he worked. It was the kind of small-town life that made everyone feel safe. But Clark knew better. He had seen too many faces, too many lies in this job, to believe that everything was as it seemed. Koda barked sharply, snapping Clark from his thoughts. He glanced down at the dog, who was already in motion, his tail rigid with purpose. Clark didn't need to ask, he knew Koda had picked up on something. Without hesitation, Clark followed, the dog leading him down the side street that bordered Dawson's house. They reached a small alley behind the house, where Clark stopped in his tracks. A single cigarette butt lay discarded on the ground, half buried in the dirt. It was barely visible, but Koda's keen nose had found it. Clark knelt down, inspecting it closely. It was a long shot, but something about it felt important. He slipped on gloves, carefully picked it up, and bagged it. The team had already moved in, surrounding the house. Clark felt his pulse quicken as they made their way to the door. Dawson was inside, but this time, Clark wasn't going to let him slip away. Not again. He stepped forward, hand on his gun, but the truth was, he didn't need to use it. The door was already opening, and Dawson stepped into the doorway, a surprised look crossing his face. "What's going on, Clark?" Rick asked, his voice calm but slightly defensive. Clark didn't answer at first. He just stared at Dawson, his mind racing. "Where were you the night Marie Hayes disappeared?" Clark asked, his tone steady. Rick's face twisted in confusion, but his eyes darted quickly, betraying his unease. "I've told you all that already. I was at work, like always. I had nothing to do with it. You know that." But Clark didn't believe him. Not anymore. He nodded at Koda, who was sitting perfectly still, watching Dawson with unwavering focus. The dog's eyes told Clark everything he needed to know. "I think you're lying, Rick," Clark said, his voice cold. "We've got evidence this time. Your DNA on fabric found near the scene, your cigarette butts, and Koda's scent trail leading straight to your door. You can't run from this anymore." Rick's face drained of color, and for a moment, he looked like a man who had realized his time had run out. He stepped back, shaking his head. "No, no. You've got it all wrong," Rick stammered. "I didn't do anything to her. I never did. I was at work, just like my alibi says." Clark stepped forward, cutting him off. "The alibi doesn't hold up anymore. You were seen arguing with Marie before she vanished. Your DNA matches the evidence we found. And now we've got the cigarette and fabric that tie you directly to the scene. It's over, Rick." For a moment, Rick didn't speak. His shoulders slumped, and he lowered his gaze. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered, "I didn't mean for it to happen. She wouldn't stop nagging me. It just happened." His confession hung in the air, and it was the final piece Clark had been waiting for. The arrest was swift after that. Dawson was taken into custody, his face ashen, his entire demeanor deflated. But the weight on Clark's chest remained. They had finally solved the case, but at what cost? For Marie's family, the truth was both a relief and a devastating blow. Marie's brother, Aaron, sat in front of the police station hours later, holding the silver bracelet that had once belonged to his sister. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "At least now we know what happened to her. The trial would come, and justice would be served." But for now, all Clark and Koda could do was watch the town slowly begin to heal, the echoes of Marie's disappearance fading, as a new chapter was written. Thank you for following this story. What do you think? Do you believe justice can truly be served when the case goes cold for so long? Comment below and let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling stories like this one.